Probably failing to plan for the day after what I think was the right thing to do in intervening in Libya.
Failing to prepare for the aftermath of the ousting of Libyan leader Col Muammar Gaddafi was the worst mistake of his presidency. That's according to US President Barack Obama. The US and other countries carried out strikes designed to protect civilians during the 2011 uprising. But after the former Libyan leader was killed, the country plunged into chaos, with armed militants taking hold amidst a massive power struggle in the oil-rich nation. But it's not the first time the US president has expressed regret over the Libyan debacle, and criticism is growing for Western intervention in the affairs of sovereign nations. So what exactly went wrong? And what lessons can be learned from Obama's Libya mistake? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, there's been plenty of reaction and analysis following US President Barack Obama recently admitting his biggest mistake. In an interview, he said he regretted handling the aftermath of the fall of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. He called the situation in Libya a mess, and he said that the US and its allies could have done more to prevent the country's descent into chaos. CCTV's Jim Spellman has more.
Asked on U.S. TV program Fox News Sunday what his biggest mistake in office has been, U.S. President Barack Obama said this.
Probably failing to plan for the day after what I think was the right thing to do in intervening in Libya.
In 2011, an international coalition that included the U.S., France, and Great Britain took military action in Libya. Later that year, Muammar Gaddafi was ousted from power and killed.
You had the Gaddafi regime massing forces prepared to carry out an act of violence against a substantial and defenseless population. And the international community, led by the United States, responded to prevent a good portion of that violence. And that obviously was a good thing.
But Libya soon descended into chaos. Rival governments formed and jockeyed for power as militias and jihadist groups, including the Islamic State, took hold.
There's a real danger that if in Libya they were able to gain control of oil-producing facilities, then they would find a way to sell it. And that would generate money to allow them to even form a quasi-state of the sort we see in Syria and Iraq.
The international community has struggled to bring order to the troubled country, even as Obama seems to admit the U.S. was at fault for poor planning in Libya. His administration seems more than willing to share the blame.
The rest of the international community did not have time and did not succeed in following through with a plan to compensate for the vacuum that was left behind.
Now, one organization that may feel vindicated by Obama's admission is the African Union, as the body rejected any foreign military intervention in Libya even before the fall of Muammar Gaddafi. CCTV's Girum Chala spoke to the African Union Commissioner for Peace and Security, Smail Chergui, about the body's current stand on foreign military interventions in African conflicts.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. How many foreign military interventions are ongoing in Africa at the moment, and how important and necessary are these interventions?
No, let me indicate that these interventions have been made by the respective governments. That was in CAR, and I think this mission now, according to the French leadership, has accomplished its mission. Normally, because UN is there now, we have an elected government, but things should go better. The second one was in North Mali, when the terrorists attacked in that country, and even they were putting the capital under threat, and that's when the government also there asked for the help. So this is, to my knowledge, the two missions that indeed we cannot forget what happened in Libya, and the fact that African Union tried to say we should give to the dialogue more chance. And you remember that we had a high-level committee of heads of states ready to go, and they were prevented to reach Tripoli and to promote a peaceful solution. Now you see that intervention was at the end for really regime change, and beyond that objective, they left behind them a real chaos that is now really having very serious consequences within Libya and in all the neighboring countries, and even in the Sahel and East Africa. So that's why we think that time has come to really hear the voice of Africa and give the chance to our own architecture for peace and security to be totally operationalized and be implemented on the ground. So whoever really likes Africa and whoever considers himself as a friend of the continent should rather work with us in operationalizing our APSA and implementing all its components. So I think in no way we can consider that it was because the Africans could not or did not have the will to intervene. We are building up our capacity, and as I told you, as soon as this African standby force and CDR are in place, then there will be no logic whatsoever that Africa needs foreign interventions.
It now turns out, by President Obama's own admission, the intervention strategy in Libya did not factor in the aftermath and its consequences. Are there any important lessons here for the African Union?
I think that it's not for us to really draw lessons, but it's rather for the others who are still thinking in terms of intervention. And here I want to take this occasion to underline that what we are looking for in Libya is first a peaceful resolution of the political crisis. And then, hopefully, as soon as the government is sworn in by the parliament, then we can work around this government to deal with also the terrorist dimension in that country.
What should Africa do to stop the phenomenon of foreign military boots on its soil? Any messages for member states?
My message is that as we are going in the next summit in July in Kigali to see the report of our envoy, Dr. Kabiruka, on Peace Fund. So hopefully that will be the occasion for member states to adopt the report and give to the Commission necessary means to implement the decision of our leaders in terms of securing at least 25% of the budget of our missions, but also going further in really financing all our activities by our own, by African means coming from member states. And I think this is really the most important message at this juncture.
We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, my expert guests will help further unpack Obama's Libya mistake. To stay with us.
сказать такие вещи, дело непростое.
It is not easy to say such things. When Barack Obama was still a senator, he criticized the actions of the administration of the day for the situation in Iraq.
Администрации за действия в Ираке. Но, к
But
сожалению,
unfortunately, when he himself was president, he made the mistakes which he himself mentioned, only this time in Libya.
и это правильно, это
And this
очень
is
хорошо,
right
что
and very good that my colleague has the courage to make such statements. Not everyone knows when to
делать
say
такие
sorry.
заявления. Не все могут это сделать.
That was Russian President Vladimir Putin speaking about President Barack Obama's admission about the Libyan intervention. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to further unpack President Obama's Libya mistake and what lessons can be learned, I have expert guest standing by in Cairo, Dr. Ziad Akil. He's a senior researcher at the Al-Akhram Center for Political and Strategic Studies. In Washington, D.C., Amira Woods, she's an associate fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies. And in Paris, current affairs commentator Victor Gao. Thank you all for joining in this conversation. I'll start off with you, Amira Woods, in Washington, D.C. Now, President Obama recently said his failure to plan after Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown in 2011 was possibly the biggest mistake of his presidency. First to you, Amira, did this come as a surprise to you?
This came as no surprise. Many of us understood that when the U.S. leading NATO started its assault on Libya, that the consequences would be disastrous. And what we have seen is that the ouster of Gaddafi in Libya not only unleashed a flow of weapons that devastated Libya and still leaves Libya unstable today, but also created a region that is now awash with weapons. We saw the coup in Mali, the instability in Mali caused by those coming with weapons from Libya into Mali. We see that the entire region has now become much more unstable. So, you know, this is a perfect example that foreign military intervention, particularly of the kind in Libya, leads to these consequences that are severe in terms of the human impact, the political as well as the economic impact that is, as we so well see, 5 years after Libya, you know, that is long-lasting and devastating in many ways.
Dr. Akil, I'm going to come to you there. Did that admission by President Obama catch you by surprise? What were your thoughts?
Well, not really. I mean, we've always said over the past 5 years that the pattern of intervention in Libya was perhaps necessary at the time, but there was absolutely no exit strategy that the U.S. or its allies in this intervention had. And President Obama admitting that this was one of the biggest mistakes of his administration was somehow expected. There is a resurrection of the old dichotomy of democratization versus stability in the Middle East and North Africa in specific. Back in 2011, there were more sentiments towards intervening to instill democratic regimes. Perhaps the intervention itself was not properly thought about, was not decently orchestrated, but back then there was an overarching sentiment of necessity to intervene for democracy. Now, after the kind of trajectory that the different Arab Spring cases have taken, we are going back to the idea, specifically in Western Europe and the US, we're going back to the idea of whether it was necessary in the first place and whether it was more kind of beneficial to simply choose stability represented in authoritarian rulers over democratic transitions that might cause serious ruptures in regional security.
We're going to come to that in a moment. But Victor Gao, I wanted to also get your thoughts here because the overriding factor is that that was the admission itself did not come as a surprise. What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, the United States remains a global leader and is the strongest military power in the world. For the United States to, initiate a military campaign which toppled the government in Libya and eventually plunged the whole country into great chaos, causing so much suffering for the people in Libya, is truly a major mistake. and the costs are so heavy that you cannot count all the details. For President Obama to admit it as a mistake is a courageous thing for the US president to do. But whether it remains the largest mistake or the most serious mistake is yet to be seen. He still has about 8 months running on his watch as the president. I hope he will no longer make any mistake like this. But compared with other mistakes that the US governments have been making over the decades, the Libyan crisis is still small mistake compared with other major mistakes. The philosophical point for the United States is that it's easier to initiate a war. It's always more difficult to exit a war. And when you have reasons to initiate a war, you still need to ponder all the consequences of what that war may bring about. Look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq, look at Syria today, and look at Libya and many other places. The US should learn a bitter lesson.
The U.S. should learn a bitter lesson. Amira Woods, though, has this changed the sentiment inside the United States itself about foreign interventions outside of the United States? Has this changed the Libyan situation? Has that changed the sentiment in the U.S.?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask in terms of that sentiment. I think both the Libya crisis as well as the lessons of Iraq have taught the American people to really be, to be averse to this military adventurism, that we've seen now under both Republican and Democratic administrations. So the American people are very hesitant in terms of both the costs, in terms of treasure and troops and lives and impact on civilians and all the rest. American people are very much opposed, I believe now, even more so after Iraq and Libya, to foreign military intervention than they were before. But what continues to exist in the U.S. as well as in many other Western countries is a machinery that is very much supplying arms, supplying private military contractors, as well as supplying foreign troops on the ground. So I think there is a machinery, an architecture in place that very much sustains a policy, irrespective of the many examples of that policy being completely flawed.
Right, Dr. Akol, has this changed though the sentiment for North Africa or for the Middle East? Has the intervention in Libya, has that changed the sentiment there, or what is the perception of foreign interventions, particularly U.S. foreign interventions?
Well, there is the U.S. intervention. I believe that it was necessary. I mean, after all, we were dealing with someone like Muammar Gaddafi, who, although managed to maintain some kind of stability inside of Libya, actually managed to do that through creating a very defunct state structure, through wasting so many resources, and actually through doing a lot of security crises over the course of his 42 years in office. So intervention inside of Libya in 2011 was something that was, I believe, more human than political. And there were a lot of actually regional and international interests being threatened by the actions of Muammar al-Gaddafi, and before those was the lives of millions of Libyans being threatened as well. So it is very, very difficult actually to judge this intervention 5 years later, because building some kind of objective criteria to actually measure how necessary that intervention was has to take into consideration the political and the social context that this intervention was made in. And basically, 2011, the map was very different back then. There was very, very major concerns about the idea of the robustness of authoritarianism in the Middle East and North Africa. And this is basically, I believe, that although recent military interventions, specifically by the US, whether in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Libya, has not been great successes, they cannot be really judged as one bundle. They have to be kind of narrowed down to the specific circumstances that led to each of them.
Let me bring you in here, Victor Gao, though. Was it necessary, though, because China did have to evacuate over 30,000 Chinese who were living in Libya at the time? Was this intervention, in your view, though, necessary?
Well, first of all, let me start with a philosophical point. I think the lesson for the African countries is to learn that it is dangerous to be an enemy of the United States, but sometimes it's even more dangerous to be a friend of the United States. Colonel Gaddafi apparently believed he had become a friend of the United States from a former enemy. And then look at what consequences that brought about eventually when he thought he could have the trust of the United States as a friend. And I think for China, China supported the United Nations resolution, but the Allied forces headed by the United States really acted way beyond what was authorized by that United Nations Security Council resolution. That was one of the reasons why eventually China vetoed the United Nations draft resolution of the Syrian crisis. And the consequences and the cost for the Chinese companies and people who worked in Libya was huge and tremendous. China did eventually organize the largest ever overseas evacuation in the Chinese history. We evacuated more than 30,000 workers and professionals and staffs out of Libya. Many Chinese properties are still being frozen in Libya, and many contracts have been broken, and China as a whole suffered a huge amount of losses in Libya. But this compared with the sacrifices of the people, the bloodshed in Libya, and the crisis and the catastrophe that the people in Libya suffered and are still suffering, is just peanuts. So I would say that for the United States ever to use force, even against a regime or a government or a country it does not like, is not the right thing to do. Always ponder again and again and think after that all the consequences involved before you ever decide to use force against another country.
Amira, would the whole question of the exit strategy and the mistake that Barack Obama alludes to, not having an exit strategy and not intervening after the intervention itself, what should the United States, what measures should have been taken by the United States after the end of the intervention?
Well, I would say it's not only the problem of an exit strategy, it's the entrance strategy that was also fatally flawed, right? So I think what we have to remember, and again, my colleague says, let's look at the context. The context in Libya was that you had an African Union at the time that had an alternate approach, that had an approach to negotiations, to peacemaking that was actually on a track that at least the African Union thought could bring success. So what the U.S. did was essentially to sidestep the African Union, to go forward with a military intervention that was disastrous from the start and has led to disastrous consequences. So it's not only a question of the exit strategy, but if you talk about the exit strategy, clearly leaving a Libya in the wake of this disastrous military intervention with political chaos that it's in now, with still the steady flow of both weapons into the country, of both U.S. Boots on the ground, U.S. military advisors, as well as private military contractors awash in the country, it is really, it's difficult to see a stability happening either politically or, quite frankly, economically anytime soon. And so what you see is this wave of people trying to seek an alternate life, getting into rickety boats, risking their lives. And we have to recognize the push factors happened when the decision was made to push forward with military intervention in places like Libya. It leads then to these human disasters with waves of people risking their lives to just find a way to put food on the table to feed their children and to have some measure of stability with a roof over their heads.
Dr. Akel, that whole issue of the failure to plan after Libyan Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown, what should that plan have been? What should that plan have contained?
Well, the problem is that we are dealing with a country like Libya with absolutely no prior political activism or a clear map of political forces under the 42 years that Gaddafi had ruled, which becomes a very vague image when you consider what are the post-revolutionary political forces that will take place inside of Libya after removing Gaddafi. Well, basically the plan should have been not simply to get rid of Gaddafi and then evacuate Libya. The plan should have been both political and military, which is something that my colleague had just said, that there could have been more political approaches. I believe that there should have been some kind of coordination between political approaches and military approaches, because while the AU, while the African Union did have some kind of a political approach, it was a political approach that was not objective by any means, and that was very much biased to Muammar Gaddafi, ignoring a lot of the crimes that he had done during the days that preceded the intervention. So my main point is that this plan should have basically taken into consideration the necessity to be politically present through regional entities or even international entities to simply aid the formation of a post-revolutionary political elite. We're not talking about a country that had political opposition that could be in charge after the removal of a dictator like Muammar Gaddafi. We're talking about a country that did not even have that did not have the slightest form of political organization. Therefore, political chaos was something that was very much expected. And when you put that next to the other regional developments in Syria, Iraq, Sinai, Yemen, Bahrain, there was a very obvious tendency towards radicalization back then that required actually the presence of political institutions, which was not a part of the US-led military intervention in 2011.
Victor Gao, you have talked about the African Union having been overlooked in this situation when discussing Libya at that time, though. Today, however, what can regional blocs or regional bodies, though, do to help in regaining stability in Libya?
Well, I think in the case of Libya, the African Union did try to do the more noble and decent thing and the respectable thing to bring the crisis in Libya to a stop. However, in retrospect, with the benefit of hindsight, I think the African Union should have been bolder, should have been standing on the principle with greater firmness and determination. Going forward, I think regional organizations like African Union and other regional organizations should really stand more united, especially when there is pressure from outside their region. People and countries beyond that particular part of the world will have much less to care about than immediate neighboring countries like African countries. And I would say once bad consequences happen, then neighboring countries suffer. And in this particular case, not only countries like Mali and immediate neighboring countries of Libya, but Europe is now becoming a victim of this groups and waves of refugees or economic migrants coming out of North Africa and Middle East and some other parts of the world. And this partially was triggered by the Libyan crisis. So if you count victims of this US mistake or a strategic mistake involving Libya, then many groups, many stakeholders are still suffering today. I would urge the US president, either President Obama today or the next US president, to read The Art of War by Sun Tzu, which was published more than 2,000 years ago. To launch a war should always be the last resort rather than the first preference. And before you launch any war, you always think about all the consequences and always think about other means and alternatives which should replace war as a means or instrument to achieve your objective. That's the truth 2,000 years ago. That remains the truth today. It was the truth for China 2,000 years ago. It is still the truth for the United States today.
Well, and that's all we have time for, I'm afraid, this week. But thank you to my guests for their insights. In Cairo, Dr. Ziad Akol, he's a senior researcher at the Al-Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies. In Washington, D.C., Amira Woods, she's an associate fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies. And in Paris, a current affairs commentator, Victor Gao. Remember, though, you can join the conversation at home through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. Goodbye.